Hey, Moto Man Dan here, and today we are going to talk about the 4 things you should avoid when you're buying your first motorcycle. So, number 1 is don't go buy your first motorcycle without some official training. And let me give you some reasons to back this up. So you're probably familiar with the Hurt Report, the motorcycle safety study that was published in 1981. I don't know how many people know how old it is, but it's still probably the most comprehensive, relevant motorcycle safety study that we have today. And the Hurt Report, goes over all kinds of different aspects of motorcycle crashes, and they evaluated rider age and whether they've been drinking and stuff. And one of the things that they looked at was what type of training people had had. The 4 types of training the Hurt Report looked at was professional training, motorcycle school or class, self-taught, and also taught by friends or family. And so the findings indicated that if you were taught by a professional, or if you went to a school or class, the risk was about the same. Those are about equal. But when you compare that to people who are self-taught, the people who are self-taught were almost twice as likely to get into an accident. And then the people who were taught by friends and family were actually almost twice as likely to get into an accident compared to the people who were self-taught. So almost 4 times as likely versus people who went to a school. So that's pretty crazy. And then the other statistic that came out of that was that 92% of all motorcycle accidents in the Hurt Report involved people who were either self-taught or taught by friends or family. So only 8% of the accidents in the Hurt Report involved people who had actually gone to some sort of official training. So that's my number 1 thing is go take the motorcycle safety class or something. Maybe you have an alternative in your area, but just a beginner one is great. They drill the controls into you, so you start to build that muscle memory, and that muscle memory is key when you're first learning just the clutch and the throttle and the brakes and all those associations, because when you're brand new, you don't have that muscle memory built in to close the throttle before you start braking, or to pull in the clutch so that the engine doesn't die, and that stuff can add up to creating an accident when you're pulling up to a stoplight, or something happens that distracts you or stresses you out, and then you just lose it. Because the controls are easy to screw up before you've built that muscle memory. So go take a class. The other thing that they talk about in classes is strategies for how to deal with various situations in traffic. And you can also get a lot more in depth on that with some books. I've been reading Staying Safe by, I think it's Larry Grudsky, and Proficient Motorcycling by I'm going to blank on the name, but I'll put links down below to those books. I think both of them are extremely valuable, and it's just worth a read. It'll teach you a little bit about your motorcycle, and it'll also just teach you about some strategies and general approaches to keeping the rubber side down. So number 2 for what not to do when buying your first motorcycle is don't buy something that bypasses your own judgment skills. And so this falls into the category of when people say, don't buy a CBR 600 for your first motorcycle, or don't buy a CX-10R, a giant leader bike with 170 horsepower or whatever they're up to these days. And I'm not going to tell you not to go buy a ZX-10R for your first bike, because I'm sure that there's some people out there, and I do think it's a minority, but I'm sure there's some people out there who are perfectly fine with that. And those people probably have more self-control than I do, or more self-control than I did when I was 19 years old. And, you know, a lot of this comes back to the fact that we've developed a lot when we're 18, 19 years old, but one thing that hasn't fully developed is our brain, specifically our prefrontal cortex, or the connection to our prefrontal cortex. And what our prefrontal cortex does is it helps us make decisions, and it helps us think ahead and see the consequences of our actions. So, you know, what are you not missing when you're 19? Well, you're not missing skill. You know, there's people that just shouldn't ride motorcycles, but if you're a skilled person and you know you're a good fit for motorcycling, then you're gonna be able to operate a motorcycle just fine once you learn how at 19. There's nothing stopping you from that. But the judgment skills might be a little bit lacking, and I'll hem and haw on a lot of bikes, but the FC09 is a blanket statement. This should not be your first motorcycle. And so that brings us to number 3. Number 3 is don't buy a bike that has super finicky controls for your first motorcycle. And I think that also ties into why, I think that ties more into why people recommend like 250s and those little bikes for a first bike, as opposed to why people say don't buy a big bike. Because just inherently, if you have a smaller, less powerful engine, then the throttle is going to be, it's just not going to do as much, right? I mean, if you've got 0 horsepower when it's closed and you've got 150 horsepower when it's open, then, you know, you move it a half a millimeter and that's 10 horsepower or something. Versus if you have a total 30 horsepower, then you move it that same amount and, you know, you're going through like 1 horsepower. So, you know, it's just going to be less jerky. And then when people aren't used to the controls, when they're still mastering the clutch and the throttle and putting it all together, you know, a little slip of the wrist can screw you up, and maybe you catch yourself on that throttle hand and it just whips your neck back and you go running off into a tree or something, like all those videos with people's first time on a dirt bike and stuff. But you don't want to do that on your first bike. So, you know, talk to people, read reviews, whatever. If it's got touchy controls, then I'm sure people will be talking about it. It was certainly a hot topic on the FC09. Last one, number 4, is a little more minor, but it's don't buy a bike that you can't afford to drop for your first bike. And I'm going to say afford. I was going to say don't buy a bike that you don't want to scratch or something, but nobody wants to scratch their bike. You know, I don't care if it's a cheap Craigslist deal or something brand new off the showroom floor. Nobody wants to drop their bike. Nobody wants to screw stuff up. But just you're a beginner, and it's just more likely to happen. You're not quite as used to balancing your motorcycle around when you're off of it and sliding it in and out of your garage. And you know, you might just have a little slip up at a stoplight and just tip it over. And so, you know, buying a cheaper used bike that might not be the bike that you ultimately want and riding around for a year, and, you know, if it tips over or whatever, it's not a big deal. I think that's the way to go. I certainly know that my first bike had its share of scratches, and I think you'll be hard pressed to find someone who didn't somehow tip over their first motorcycle. So that is Dan's 4 things not to do when you're buying your first motorcycle.